There are storms that soak your clothes, and storms that drown your entire life. Ethan Mercer never imagined a doorbell at midnight could tear his world apart a second time. The first time was a phone call from a hospital. This time, it was a woman standing in the pouring rain, wearing a soaked cashmere coat that probably cost more than his truck, staring at him like she already owned everything inside his house. Like she'd been waiting years for this exact moment. And the worst part? She had. Hit that like button right now. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Stay with me until the end. You won't regret it. The rain had been falling since 4 in the afternoon, and by 10 o'clock it had turned into something biblical, the kind of storm that bends trees sideways and turns gutters into rivers. Millfield wasn't a big town. It wasn't the kind of place where dramatic things happened. It was a town of cracked parking lots and diners that closed at 9, and neighbors who waved from driveways without ever learning your last name. Ethan had chosen it deliberately 3 years ago, after everything fell apart. He'd wanted invisible. He'd wanted quiet. He'd gotten both. Until tonight. He was in the garage when he heard the knock, not on the front door, but on the side door that led directly into his workspace. Nobody knocked on that door. His customers called ahead, pulled into the driveway during daylight hours, and left their keys in the ignition. His neighbors knew better than to bother him after dark. And his son, Noah, was already asleep upstairs, small and warm and oblivious to the weather hammering the roof. Ethan set down the wrench he was holding and wiped his hands on a rag that was already too dirty to do much good. He crossed the garage in 4 steps, stepped over a transmission he'd been rebuilding for 2 days, and pulled the side door open. The wind hit him first, then the rain, sideways and cold, then her. She was standing close enough that he could see her clearly despite the dark. A woman, maybe a few years younger than him, with wet black hair plastered against her face and an expression that belonged on someone testifying in court. Her coat was expensive. Her shoes were ruined. She was holding a black umbrella that the wind had already broken, the frame bent backward like a broken wing. And she didn't seem to notice or care. She looked at him the way people look at something they've been searching for. "Ethan Mercer," she said. Not a question. "Yeah." He leaned against the door frame. "You lost?" "No." She tilted her chin slightly. "I'm exactly where I need to be. My name is Victoria Ashford." She paused, waiting for something. Recognition, maybe. When his face gave her nothing, something flickered in her eyes. Not hurt. More like recalibration. "I need to come inside. It's 10:30 at night. I'm aware. I don't know you." "You knew my company," she said. "And you knew my mother. And your wife." She stopped. Just briefly, just half a second, but he caught it. "Your wife knew me. A long time ago." The name landed differently than he expected. Not like a punch, more like a stone dropped into still water. The impact small, the ripple spreading outward in every direction. Claire. He hadn't said her name out loud in weeks. He made himself not say it most days because saying it made Noah ask questions that Ethan didn't have clean answers to. Because saying it in the garage, alone at night, with grease on his hands and a stack of unpaid invoices on his workbench, saying it made him feel like he was standing at the edge of something he couldn't come back from. He stepped back from the door. "Come in, Mbok." She stood in his kitchen like she'd never been in a kitchen that small in her life, and maybe she hadn't. He'd looked her up on his phone while she was in the bathroom. 30 seconds of searching confirmed what the cashmere and the posture and the broken umbrella she'd abandoned without a second glance had already suggested. Victoria Ashford, 30 years old. CEO of Ashford Global Logistics, a company with operations on 4 continents and revenue figures that Ethan couldn't fully process because they were too many digits. Her father had built the company. He'd died 2 years ago. She'd taken it over and, by most accounts, driven it harder than he ever had. She sat down at his kitchen table without being invited to. He put a mug of coffee in front of her because it was cold and wet outside and because he didn't know what else to do, and she wrapped both hands around it without drinking. "You said you knew Claire," he said. He stayed standing, leaning back against the counter with his arms crossed. He wanted the distance. "I said she knew me." Victoria corrected it quietly. "When she was 22 and I was 20, she worked at my father's company. Entry level. Accounts receivable. She was good at her job, better than people gave her credit for. She looked down at the coffee. She and I weren't close, but we weren't strangers either. Okay. 3 years before she died, Victoria said, Claire discovered something in the company's financial records. Something she wasn't supposed to find. She looked up at him. She brought it to my father directly. She trusted him. That was her mistake. Ethan's jaw tightened. She was fired for stealing. Internal audit found. The internal audit was fabricated, Victoria said. Her voice was flat and precise, like she'd rehearsed this, like she'd spent a long time figuring out how to say it without flinching. I know that now. I didn't know it then. I was 20 years old, I was in college, and my father handled company matters without involving me. When the accusation surfaced, I had no reason to question it. Neither did anyone else. She lost everything. His voice came out lower than he intended. You understand that, right? She lost her career, her reputation. People in this town treated her like a thief for years. Even after she died, some of them still... He stopped, pressed his back teeth together. What do you want, Ms. Ashford? Why are you at my door at 10:30 at night in a storm? She set the coffee mug down carefully, aligned it with the edge of the table, which he noticed and didn't understand. Because 3 weeks ago I found evidence that someone inside my company has been building a case against me. Not just professionally, legally. They've manufactured documentation that I authorized transactions I never touched. If it goes public, I lose control of the board. If it goes to the SEC, I could face criminal liability for something I didn't do. She met his eyes. Sound familiar? The parallel hung in the air between them. There's a solution, she said. A temporary one, but it requires your cooperation. What kind of solution? Marriage, she said. He laughed. He actually laughed, a short, disbelieving sound that he couldn't stop in time. You're serious? My enemies are less likely to destroy me if I appear stable, grounded. A family image it's strategic. Your son is 8 years old. You're a widower with a clean record and no corporate ties, which means you can't be weaponized against me. And your situation, she paused. You have debts that are about to become a legal problem. Medical bills from Claire's treatment that were sold to a collections agency 18 months ago. They've engaged a law firm. You're going to be sued, Ethan, not for an amount you can manage, for an amount that, if a judge awards a lien, could cost you this house. He went very still. I have the documentation, she said. The collections agency, the law firm, the amount. I also have the resources to make it disappear, not reduce it. Disappear it. In exchange for 6 months. A public arrangement, a marriage on paper. She watched him carefully. I'm not asking you to love me, I'm asking you to stand next to me. The silence stretched. Outside, the rain was getting worse. You said this was about a debt, he said slowly. When you knocked on the door, you said you were here about a debt. Your wife found something, Victoria said. Something she died before she could expose. I believe she hid it. And I believe that whatever she hid is the only thing that can actually save me and clear her name permanently. She leaned forward slightly. I owe her that, and I'm running out of time. He didn't say yes that night. He said he needed to think, which was true, and he said she could stay in the guest room because the storm had knocked out a transformer 2 miles down the road and the highways were closed, which was also true. She accepted without protest, which surprised him. He'd expected argument. Instead, she just nodded, stood, and asked if she could borrow a phone charger. He lay awake until 3 in the morning listening to rain. He thought about Claire. He thought about the way she'd looked in the last months of her illness. Not the worst of it, but the middle part, when she'd still been able to sit up and talk and hold Noah. But when the weight of everything had already started pulling at the corners of her eyes. He thought about the night she'd grabbed his wrist in the hospital and said, I didn't do it, Ethan. I need you to know I didn't do it. And he'd told her he knew. He'd told her it didn't matter. He'd meant both things, and looking back, he understood that neither answer had been enough. She'd needed him to believe her and to care, and he'd only given her half. He thought about Noah, 8 years old, gap-toothed, obsessed with anything that had an engine, afraid of thunderstorms but determined not to show it. Noah, who slept with a photograph of his mother on his nightstand and had started asking lately quiet, careful questions about why some kids at school had said bad things about her. And he thought about the debt. $47,000. The number had been living in his chest for a year like a stone he couldn't cough up. At 3:15, he got up, went to the kitchen, and made himself a bowl of cereal he didn't eat. He sat at the table where Victoria Ashford had sat a few hours earlier and looked at the ring of condensation her coffee mug had left on the wood. 6 months. Stand next to her. He thought about what she'd said. I believe she hit it. Not, I think. Not maybe. Believe. The word of someone who'd looked into something hard enough to form a conviction. What if Claire had found something? What if the last year of her life, sick and exhausted and still carrying the weight of a false accusation, she'd been quietly holding on to proof? What if she'd had it the whole time and never told him because she didn't want to put him in danger? That would be exactly like her. Exactly, precisely, infuriatingly like her. Victoria was in the kitchen at 6:45 in the morning, already dressed in clothes that weren't the ruined ones from the night before, which meant she'd had a bag in her car, which meant she'd planned to stay, which meant the storm had been convenient but not essential. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at her. She looked back. You planned this, he said. You had a bag. Yes. You were confident I'd agree. No, she said, and he believed her somehow. I was confident I'd need a place to sleep whether you agreed or not. Those are different things. She was holding a glass of water. Have you made a decision? He heard movement upstairs. Noah, waking up. In about 3 minutes, his son would be down here, and there'd be questions, and Ethan would have to navigate them carefully. I have one condition, he said. What is it? Noah comes with me. Wherever we go, he goes. He's not staying here alone. He's not being shipped off to a relative. He's not a separate matter. He's the main matter. Something moved across her face. It wasn't the expression he expected. Not inconvenience, not calculation, something smaller and less readable than either of those. Agreed, she said. And he doesn't know it's fake. He's 8. He'll... Ethan rubbed a hand across the back of his neck. I don't want him to know it's an arrangement. I'll figure out how to explain what it is, but not the fakeness of it. Not yet. That complicates things. I know, but that's the condition. She nodded slowly. Agreed. Footsteps on the stairs. Fast, uneven. Noah took stairs 2 at a time when he wasn't thinking about it. He appeared in the doorway in pajamas with race cars on them, hair sticking up on one side, and stopped dead when he saw Victoria. He looked at her, looked at his father, back at her. Who are you at? He said with the blunt honesty that 8-year-olds deploy without understanding how it lands. Victoria set her water glass down on the counter. She looked at the boy with an expression Ethan couldn't entirely read. Careful, he thought. Genuinely careful, not performed. My name is Victoria, she said. I got caught in the storm last night. Your dad let me stay. Noah considered this. Our couch is really uncomfortable, he said. I used the guest room. Oh, that one's okay. He looked at his father again. Is she staying for breakfast? Ethan met Victoria's eyes over his son's head. Yeah, he said. She's staying for breakfast. He called his lawyer that afternoon. A tired, underpaid man named Gerald, who handled most of Millfield's legal problems from an office above a dry cleaner's, and confirmed what Victoria had said. The debt had been sold. A firm in the city had acquired it. They'd filed preliminary paperwork 3 days ago. Gerald's voice was careful and apologetic, and ultimately offered nothing useful. Ethan hung up and sat in his truck in the parking lot behind the shop for 15 minutes. Then he called Victoria. I'll do it, he said. A pause. Okay. 6 months. 6 months, she agreed. You said you'd make the debt disappear. I'll have it handled by the end of the week. And you'll tell me everything. About Claire, about what you think she found, about all of it. No filtering, no deciding what I'm ready to hear. Everything. Another pause, longer this time. That might not be comfortable for either of us. I didn't ask for comfortable, he said. I asked for everything. All right, she said. Everything. He started the truck, sat there with the engine running and his hands on the wheel and the radio off. 6 months standing next to a woman he didn't know, in a world he'd never touched, fighting a war he didn't understand yet. He thought about Claire's face in that hospital room. "I didn't do it, Ethan." "Neither did you," he said to her quietly in the empty cab of his truck. "And I'm going to prove it." They left Millfield on a Thursday, 2 weeks after the storm. Ethan packed his and Noah's things into 3 bags. He'd always been light that way, never accumulated much, closed up the shop with a handwritten note for his 2 regular customers, and arranged for Gerald to forward his mail. Noah took the ride with the focused energy of a child who'd been told this was an adventure and had decided to treat it exactly as such. He asked questions about the city the whole way. How tall were the buildings? Were there real highways, the big ones? Did Victoria's house have a yard? Could he bring his bike? Victoria's car, a black SUV driven by a man named Marcus, who clearly served some function beyond simply driving, answered Noah's questions with the kind of patient brevity that suggested he'd dealt with children before. Victoria sat in the front and looked at her phone and occasionally turned to answer a question directly when Noah addressed her specifically. "Is your house really big?" Noah asked her, somewhere around the 90-minute mark. Victoria turned around. "Yes." "How big?" She thought about it for a moment. "You know your school gym?" "Yeah." "Bigger than that." Noah's eyes went wide. He turned to his father with an expression of complete disbelief. Ethan shrugged, which made the kid face forward again, processing. Ethan watched the landscape change, the small-town rooftops giving way to suburbs, then the suburbs thickening into the first real density of the city, and tried to slow his own pulse down to something manageable. He'd said yes to this. He was doing this. He was going to live in a woman's house, pretend to be her husband, try to unravel a conspiracy that had been running for years, and somehow keep his 8-year-old from picking up on the fact that everything around him was constructed. No problem. But the house, he refused to call it a mansion, though it clearly was, sat behind a gate in a neighborhood where the trees were old enough to arch completely over the street. It was gray stone and large windows, and a front door that looked like it weighed 500 pounds. There were people inside when they arrived. A woman named Constance, who managed the household and who greeted Victoria with the clipped efficiency of a long-working relationship, and 2 others whose names Ethan didn't catch. Noah stood in the entryway and looked straight up at the ceiling. "Whoa," he said, and his voice echoed slightly. "Your room is upstairs," Victoria told him. "Second door on the left. Constance will show you." "Does it have a window?" "It has 3. Noah looked at his father one more time, a quick, checking look, the kind he gave when he was deciding whether something was okay, and then followed Constance up the staircase. Ethan watched him go. Then he looked at Victoria. She was already watching him, and for a moment neither of them said anything. "Ground rules," she said finally. "Yeah. In public, we behave like a couple, not a theatrical one, just present. We don't need to perform for cameras, but we need to be convincing to people who are looking for cracks. Okay? In private, you have your space, I have mine. There are 6 bedrooms. Pick whichever one you want that isn't mine, or the one Constance put Noah in. Fair. My schedule is complicated. There will be days where I'm gone before you're awake and back after you're asleep. I'll try to communicate that in advance. I'm not always good at it." "I'll manage," he said. Then, "My schedule matters too. I don't have staff. I'm the one who drops Noah off and picks him up and makes his lunch and knows which foods he won't eat." Something shifted in her expression. "I wasn't suggesting otherwise." "I know. I'm just establishing it up front." She nodded. Then she turned slightly, looking toward the far end of the entryway. "There's one more thing." She said it without looking at him. "I need you to understand that what you heard last night—" She stopped, corrected herself. "The things I told you about Claire, I wasn't using them to manipulate you." He looked at her profile. Her jaw was tight. "I didn't say you were," he said. "No, but you thought it." She finally turned to look at him. "I wanted you to know that if I could have come to you with nothing, just the arrangement, just the debt and the solution, I would have. I added Claire's name because it was relevant, not because I needed the leverage." He studied her for a moment. The overhead light was harsh and she looked tired underneath the composure, in a way she probably didn't let many people see. I believe you, he said, and then, because he wanted to be honest, mostly, she almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. That's more than I expected, she said, and turned and walked deeper into the house. That first night, Ethan lay in a bedroom that was larger than his entire living room back in Millfield, with sheets that were probably thread-counted to an absurd degree, listening to the silence of a house where sound was properly insulated. He was thinking about Claire again. He always was, in the dark. But tonight it was different. Tonight he wasn't thinking about what he'd lost. He was thinking about what she'd known. She'd found something in those financial records, something big enough that someone had bothered to destroy her reputation over it, big enough to get her fired, discredited, buried under a manufactured accusation. All the quiet, calculated cruelty of powerful people protecting something they couldn't afford to lose. She'd been 22 years old, working entry-level accounts receivable, and she'd found it. She was good at her job, Victoria had said, better than people gave her credit for. He thought about the careful way Claire had handled numbers, the way she'd tracked every hospital bill, every insurance claim, every penny of their household budget, even when things got desperate. Organized to a degree that had sometimes frustrated him in the small ways, but that had also meant their finances were never chaotic, never out of hand, even when they should have been. Even at the end, when the treatment costs were stacking up and he was working 60-hour weeks, she'd known exactly what they owed, and to whom. She'd have noticed something wrong in a financial record the way a musician notices a wrong note. Immediately, instinctively, before she could even name what felt off. And then she'd done the brave, stupid, fatal thing. She'd told someone. He turned onto his side in the dark. I'm going to find it, he thought. Whatever she hid, wherever she put it, I'm going to find it. It wasn't a plan. It was barely even a promise. But it was the first thing he'd felt certain about in years. And certainty, even the small, fragile kind, was worth something. In the room 2 doors down the hall, Noah was sleeping, and the night was quiet. And outside this enormous house, a city hummed and breathed without caring about any of them. Ethan closed his eyes. In the morning, everything would start. The first week inside Victoria Ashford's world felt like learning to walk in someone else's shoes, the kind that almost fit but pressed wrong in ways you couldn't explain to anyone. Ethan had expected the wealth to be the hard part. The high ceilings, the staff who appeared and disappeared with professional invisibility, the kitchen stocked with things he couldn't identify, and dinners that arrived at the table looking like they belonged in a magazine. He'd expected to feel out of place in all of that, and he did, but not in the way he'd anticipated. It wasn't humiliating. It was more like being a left-handed person in a world built entirely for the right hand. A constant, low-grade friction that nobody else seemed to notice. What actually caught him off guard was the schedule. Victoria moved through her days like someone who had made peace with the fact that time was a resource she would always be running short on. She was out of the house by 6:30 most mornings, sometimes earlier. She came home in the evenings with her phone still pressed to her ear and her coat still buttoned, and she'd walk straight through the entryway into her office and close the door. Some nights she came out for dinner. Some nights she didn't. When she did come out, she was present in the way that someone can be present when they're actively choosing to be, which is different from the kind of presence that comes naturally. She'd ask Noah about his day. She'd listen to the answer. She'd ask follow-up questions that showed she'd actually processed what he said. But Ethan could see the effort in it, the slight pause before she spoke, the way she held herself very still, as though stillness helped her concentrate. Noah, for his part, was adapting with the elasticity that belongs exclusively to children. He'd found a spot in the house, a window seat at the end of the upstairs hallway with a view of the back garden, and claimed it the way kids claim spaces, with a library book and a juice box, and the absolute conviction that the spot was now his. He'd started at a new school that Monday and come home opinionated about it. His teacher was okay. His classroom was small. One kid named Marcus, same name as the driver, which Noah found hilarious, had shown him where the good lunch tables were. He missed his best friend from Millfield, but was handling it the way Ethan had hoped he would, which was imperfectly but honestly, with occasional statements like, "I wish Cody was here," delivered plainly, and then dropped, not carried around all day as a grievance. What Noah hadn't asked yet, and what Ethan was quietly dreading, was any question that would require him to explain what exactly his relationship with Victoria was. So far, he'd accepted her presence with the same logic he'd accepted the house. Large and unusual, but apparently his life now, so okay. He called her Victoria because that was what she'd introduced herself as. He talked to her when she was in the room and didn't seem troubled by her absences. Children are better than adults at accepting the shape of things without demanding explanations. It was the third morning, a Saturday, when the first crack in the arrangement showed itself. Ethan was making eggs at the stove. The kitchen was enormous, and he'd decided on the first day to use it anyway, because cooking in it felt like the one thing he could do that was entirely his. When Victoria came in still dressed for sleep, which he hadn't seen before, she was in a gray long-sleeve shirt and sweatpants, hair loose, and she looked younger and considerably more human than she did in the tailored armor she wore to work. She stopped short when she saw him at the stove, as if she'd calculated that he'd still be asleep. "I didn't know you cooked," she said. "You didn't ask." She went to the coffee machine, a device with enough buttons to fly a small aircraft, and operated it with the automatic ease of long habit. She leaned against the counter with her mug and watched him with an expression he was starting to recognize, the one that meant she was assessing something. "We have a dinner on Wednesday," she said. "My CFO and 2 board members. It's informal, at least on the surface. You should know that it's not actually informal. Meaning they'll be watching. Meaning Richard Hale will be watching. He's been positioning himself on the board for 3 months in ways that are structured to look like normal corporate maneuvering." She drank her coffee. "He's one of the people trying to take me down. He hasn't shown his hand completely, but Wednesday is a test. He wants to see whether I'm stable, whether I have backup. And I'm the backup. You're the evidence that I have a life outside of this company," she said, "which makes me harder to paint as erratic or isolated." Ethan pushed the eggs around in the pan. "What do I need to know about him?" "He's 61, Yale-educated, been on our board for 7 years. He's smart and he's patient, and he understands that the best way to destroy someone in a boardroom is to make it look like they're destroying themselves." She paused. "He'll try to get you talking about things you don't know. He'll be friendly about it, warm, even. He'll ask about your work, your background, and somewhere in that conversation he'll be looking for whatever he can use." "I'm a mechanic from a small town," Ethan said. "There's not much to use." "He'll find something." She said it without cruelty, just flatly. "They always do." He looked at her over his shoulder. "What do I do with Noah on Wednesday?" "Constance can stay with him?" Noah doesn't know Constance that well yet. They've been getting along. Getting along isn't the same as being comfortable enough for me to leave him with her at night. He turned back to the pan. "I'll figure it out. I just need to know the time." A pause. 7. "Okay." She was quiet for a moment, and he thought she was going to go back to her room, but she didn't move. He could feel her still there, standing at the counter with her coffee. "You could bring him," she said finally. He turned to look at her properly. She was looking at the window. "Board members have kids," she said. "Grandkids. A child at the table actually reinforces the image I need to project. It's not inappropriate. And Noah's good in social situations from what I can see." "He's 8. "He's composed," she said. "He asks questions instead of acting out, and he reads the room better than most adults." She looked at Ethan. "But it's your call. I'm not telling you to do it." Ethan considered it for a moment. Noah would probably love it, honestly. He'd sit at a big table and eat fancy food and be irrepressibly himself, and Ethan would spend the whole evening monitoring him with one eye and managing his own performance with the other. It sounded exhausting, but leaving him with Constance at night too soon felt wrong, too. "We'll bring him," he said. "But if he gets tired or uncomfortable, we leave." "Agreed." He put the eggs on a plate and set it on the kitchen island. After a second, he added a second plate because she was standing there and it seemed rude not to. She looked at the plate for a moment, then pulled out a stool and sat down. They ate in silence that wasn't quite comfortable but wasn't hostile either. Just 2 people in a large kitchen on a Saturday morning, working out the shape of something neither of them had a template for. Outside, Noah's footsteps appeared at the top of the stairs and began their characteristic 2-at-a-time descent. The dinner on Wednesday was exactly what Victoria had said it would be. Informal on the surface, a calculated exercise underneath. Richard Hale was tall and had the kind of face that was permanently arranged in an expression of engaged interest, the sort of face you'd trust immediately if you weren't paying attention. He'd shaken Ethan's hand with both of his, that particular grip that implies warmth and tends to hide its own intentions, and said he'd heard a great deal about him, which was almost certainly not true. "What line of work are you in?" he asked, early in the evening when they were still standing with drinks and the dinner table wasn't yet set. "Mechanic," Ethan said. "Automotive. I have a shop." "Hands-on work." Hale nodded with the expression of a man performing appreciation for something he considered minor. "There's real value in that. We've become too disconnected from things that actually work with our hands." He glanced at Victoria. "Victoria always struck me as someone who would find that grounding." "She found me in a storm," Ethan said, which was true enough that he could say it without discomfort, and just unusual enough that it deflected Hale's next question while he processed it. Victoria, standing at his shoulder, made a small sound that might have been the beginning of a laugh. Hale tried twice more during drinks, once to ask how long they'd known each other, once to circle back to his background in a way that seemed casual but was building toward something. Both times Ethan answered accurately enough that there was nothing to catch him in, and briefly enough that there was nothing to examine. Noah helped, though not in a calculated way. Noah helped the way Noah always helped, by simply being himself with complete confidence. He sat at the dinner table between Ethan and Victoria and ate his food with genuine enthusiasm and asked Hale's wife, a pleasant woman named Diane, who clearly found the child delightful, what the most interesting place she'd ever been was. Diane said Kyoto, and Noah asked what Kyoto was, and a 15-minute conversation followed that completely derailed whatever thread Hale had been pulling. Victoria watched this from across the table with an expression that Ethan caught only in glimpses. A quick look toward Noah, then toward him, then back to the CFO on her left, who was talking about quarterly projections. The expression was hard to name, not warmth exactly. Something adjacent to it, something that looked a little like surprise. Later, in the car home, Noah fell asleep against the window before they'd even left the neighborhood. Victoria looked straight ahead at the road. "That went reasonably well," she said, which from her was probably equivalent to someone else saying it had gone brilliantly. "Hale's not finished," Ethan said. "No, he never is." She paused. "You handled him well." "I didn't handle him. I just didn't give him anything." "That's handling him," she said. Wasam. The week settled into something that resembled a routine, which Ethan hadn't expected and suspected Victoria hadn't either. He enrolled Noah in a school that turned out to be good, genuinely good, not just expensive, and fell into the rhythm of morning drop-offs and pickup times that were sometimes complicated by Victoria's schedule and sometimes not. He found a garage 3 miles from the house that let him work part-time because he needed to do something with his hands, and because sitting in a mansion waiting to perform a marriage felt like a particular kind of decay. Victoria hadn't objected. She'd actually seemed mildly relieved, which told him she'd been trying to figure out how to suggest it without it sounding like she was managing him. He was learning how to read her, which was harder than reading most people because she had spent considerable energy making herself unreadable. She was precise with language. She didn't use a word she hadn't decided on, didn't make a statement she hadn't considered. Her emotions showed in small things: the speed at which she typed when she was agitated, the way she held her coffee mug with one hand versus two depending on her stress level, the very particular silence that came over her face when she heard something that bothered her and was deciding whether to address it. He was increasingly sure, under pressure that she hadn't fully disclosed to him. He saw it on the night he came home late from the garage, Noah already in bed, the house quiet, and found her office light still on at 11:30. He knocked. She said, "Come in," with a voice that was flat in the wrong way. She was at her desk with 3 separate documents spread in front of her, and her laptop open to what looked like a financial spreadsheet, and she had her jacket off and her sleeves rolled up and her hair pinned back badly, like she'd done it in frustration rather than intention. She looked up when he came in, and there was a half second, just a fraction of a moment, before the professional composure reassembled itself. He'd seen what was underneath it before it closed. She looked exhausted and scared. "It's late," he said. I know. Have you eaten? She paused, clearly doing the calculation. I had something at 4. He went to the kitchen and made her a sandwich, which was not a complicated thing and not a romantic thing, just a practical thing that took 6 minutes. He brought it back and set it on the edge of her desk and didn't comment on the documents because he hadn't been invited to. She looked at the sandwich for a moment. You didn't have to do that. I know. She picked it up and ate it, and he sat in the chair across from her desk, and they stayed there in the quiet of the house for a while, not talking, which was a different kind of silence than the ones they'd had before. Eventually, she said, without looking up from the spreadsheet, They've moved faster than I expected. Hale? Hale and at least 2 others on the board. They've been coordinating. There's a shareholder meeting in 8 weeks, and they're planning to call a vote of no confidence if they can get enough support. She finally looked up. The documentation they've manufactured against me, it's good work. It would take a forensic audit to unravel it, and they know the board won't approve a forensic audit because 2 of the 3 people who'd vote on it are already in their camp. What about the evidence you said Claire found? He hadn't pushed on this in weeks. He'd been waiting, partly because he was still processing everything and partly because he understood that Victoria was operating on multiple fronts simultaneously, and he didn't want to add to the noise. But 8 weeks suddenly felt like a wall rather than a horizon. You said you believe she hid it. Have you been looking? Victoria set down the sandwich. I've had people checking, carefully, quietly. I couldn't look openly without flagging it to the wrong people. But so far, she shook her head. Nothing. Whatever she hid it well. Tell me exactly what you think she found, he said. Not the summary, the details. Because I've been thinking about her, and if I know what she was looking for and how she found it, I might be able to figure out where she'd put it. Victoria studied him. This could be a longer conversation. It's 11:30 on a Wednesday. I'm not going anywhere. She closed the laptop, folded her hands on the desk, and she told him. The full version took over an hour, and it was worse than the summary had been. The fraud that Claire had stumbled onto wasn't incidental. It wasn't someone skimming from expense accounts or inflating invoices. It was structural. Someone inside the company's senior leadership had been routing money through a network of shell companies for years, siphoning off funds in amounts that individually looked like normal operational costs, but collectively added up to something in the hundreds of millions. The shell companies had fake addresses, fake directors, fake paper trails that were just plausible enough to survive a casual audit. But someone who actually understood accounts receivable, someone who processed invoices, who tracked payments in and out, who saw the numbers at the working level rather than the summary level, that person might notice a pattern. She would have noticed, Ethan said quietly, when Victoria reached that part. She would have noticed the same account number appearing twice in different company names. She'd have caught it. I think she did. Victoria's voice was careful. And I think she tracked it back far enough to understand what she was looking at. And then I think she made the mistake of trying to report it through legitimate channels instead of going straight to an outside authority. She went to your father. My father was... Victoria stopped. Started again. My father was not the man I thought he was. I've had 2 years since his death to understand that, and I still don't have the complete picture. Her jaw tightened. I believe he wasn't the architect of the fraud, but I believe he knew about it and protected whoever was, and I believe that when Claire came to him, he told whoever it was, and that person arranged to have her discredited before she could go anywhere else with what she knew. The room was quiet enough that Ethan could hear the clock on the wall. Who? He said. It wasn't a full question, just the word. My uncle, Victoria said. My father's younger brother. His name is Gerald Ashford. He's been on the company's advisory board for 15 years and has a minority stake in 3 of our largest subsidiaries. She said it steadily, the way you say something you've had to rehearse saying out loud because the first time you said it, you couldn't get through it. Gerald orchestrated it, I'm almost certain, but almost certain isn't evidence. And the evidence Claire found is the only thing that would make it unchallengeable. Ethan sat with that for a long moment. Gerald Ashford, an uncle, family, the particular poison of betrayal that comes from inside the house. You've been protecting me, he said slowly, since before you came to my door. You said someone had been protecting me without my knowing, That was you. She didn't look away. When I started to understand what had happened to Claire, I traced back everything connected to her, including you, including the debt, including the law firm that was building a case. I'd been watching the situation for 6 months before I came to Millfield. You could have told me that up front. I could have, she said. I wasn't sure how you'd receive the information that I'd been monitoring your financial situation without your knowledge. He almost said something sharp, held it back. Because she wasn't wrong. If she'd opened with that, he'd have thrown her out in the rain and not thought twice. What stopped you from going to the authorities with what you already knew? Without the evidence Claire hid, everything I have is circumstantial and inferential. Gerald's lawyers would dismantle it in a week. And worse, going public without the proof gives him time to destroy whatever she left behind. If it exists and he finds out I'm looking, it disappears. She met his eyes. It has to be found first. Then we move. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, looking at the floor between them, thinking about Claire at 22, processing invoices, finding a thread and pulling it, thinking about where she'd have put something she needed to keep safe, somewhere she could trust, somewhere that wouldn't be connected to the company, to the accusation, to any part of the life that had been taken from her. Somewhere personal. He looked up. I need to go back to Millfield. When? This weekend. I have some boxes in storage, things from our old house that I kept. I never went through all of them. After she died, I just packed everything and put it away. He paused. If she hid something, it's in there. It would have to be. Victoria was quiet for a moment, then she nodded. I'll come with you. You don't need to. I know what I'm looking for, she said. You know where to look. We both need to be there. He couldn't argue with the logic, even though part of him had wanted to. Going back to Millfield, going through Claire's things, he'd wanted to do that alone. But alone wasn't what this was anymore. Okay, he said. That night, the overheard conversation happened. He hadn't been looking for it. He'd been walking back from the kitchen, past midnight, glass of water, couldn't sleep, when he passed Victoria's office and heard her voice through the door. It wasn't raised. It never was. But there was something in the tone that stopped him 2 steps past the door and made him stand there in the dark hallway without moving. She was on the phone. I understand the timeline, Marcus. I'm not asking you to slow down. I'm asking you to be careful. A pause. Because if he finds out we've been looking, the response will not be legal. I've seen how he handles exposure. Claire Mercer is what happens when Gerald Ashford feels cornered. Another pause. Longer. No, don't touch those accounts yet. Not until we have the evidence in hand. A pause. Ethan is... She stopped. Something shifted in the silence. He's handling it better than I expected. She stopped again, like she was choosing words carefully, even on a private call. He's more capable than I gave him credit for. His wife must have trusted him with more than she let on. He'll find it, Marcus. I think she would have made sure he could, even if he didn't know it yet. A long pause where Marcus apparently said something. I know, Victoria said quietly. I know what it means if we're wrong. I know what happens to him. A pause. I'm not going to let that happen. Ethan stood in the hallway in the dark and didn't move for a long moment. She'd said it without knowing he was there, without an audience, without any reason to perform. She knew what happened to him if this went wrong. The debt, the house, Noah's stability, all the fragile scaffolding he'd built from the wreckage of the last 3 years. She knew what was at stake, and she'd said, plainly, to a man on the phone in an empty office at midnight, that she wasn't going to let it happen. He walked back to his room. He lay in the dark for a long time. He'd started this whole thing thinking he understood the transaction. She needed something from him. He needed something from her, and both of them would get through it and exit cleanly on the other side. He'd kept himself at the right distance from that logic, using it like insulation against caring too much about anything in this house that wasn't Noah. But you couldn't entirely stay at a distance from someone you ate breakfast with and watched think and made sandwiches for at 11:30 at night. You couldn't stay at a distance from someone you'd seen scared, who'd seen you scared. who'd said your dead wife's name and meant it without performance. He wasn't in love with her. He wasn't anything close to that, and he knew it. But he also wasn't a stranger anymore. And the border between those two things was harder to locate than he'd expected. He thought about what she'd said. His wife must have trusted him with more than she let on. He'll find it. I think she would have made sure he could, even if he didn't know it yet. Claire. Always 10 steps ahead, always quiet about it. He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes and breathed. This weekend, he was going back to Millfield, going through the boxes, finding whatever she'd left him, because she had left him something. He felt it with a certainty that didn't need logic to hold it up. Claire had known the risk she was carrying. She'd have made sure there was a way through it. She'd have trusted him to find it. She'd just trusted him to find it without knowing he was looking. That was so entirely, completely her. He almost smiled. It was the kind of almost smile that lives right next to grief, in the territory where memory is still warm enough to feel like presence. Okay, he said to the dark. I'm looking. They drove to Millfield on a Saturday morning with Noah in the back seat and a thermos of coffee between them, and almost nothing said for the first 40 minutes. It was an uncomfortable silence. It had become something else over the weeks, a silence they'd both learned to inhabit without needing to fill it. Victoria looked out the passenger window at the landscape reversing itself, city giving way to suburb, giving way to the stretched-out quiet of smaller places. Ethan drove the way he always drove, hands easy on the wheel, eyes forward, thinking about something he wasn't saying yet. Noah had brought a book and wasn't reading it. He was watching the road the way kids watch roads, tracking the exits and the gas stations and the farms appearing in the distance with the serious attention of someone mapping territory he might need to know later. Is our old house still there? He asked, somewhere around the 90-minute mark. Yeah, Ethan said. Someone else lives there now. We're not going to the house. We're going to Uncle Pete's storage unit. Why? I've got some boxes there, things I need to go through. Noah absorbed this. Mom's stuff? The word landed in the car the way it always did. Not like an explosion, more like a change in air pressure. Ethan's hands stayed exactly where they were on the wheel. Some of it, he said. Noah looked out the window again. Okay, he said, which was the whole of it. Victoria hadn't moved. She was still looking out her window, and her face was doing nothing visible, but her hand had closed slightly around the thermos in her lap. Pete Callahan had been Ethan's friend since they were 17 and had remained so through the specific kind of loyalty that doesn't require regular contact or emotional articulation. They could go 4 months without talking and then spend an afternoon together in a garage and feel nothing had been lost. Pete was 2 years older, ran a small landscaping business, and had a storage unit behind his property where he'd offered to hold Ethan's boxes after the move to the city. He'd said, "Don't worry about it. It's not a problem. Call me when you need them," and had meant all three things. He was standing in his driveway when they pulled in, which meant he'd been watching from somewhere inside. He had the broad, unhurried look of a man who'd spent years working outside in all weather, and he shook Ethan's hand and said not much, which was normal, and then he looked at Victoria with the kind of look that said he had a lot of questions and was successfully not asking any of them. "This is Victoria," Ethan said. "Pete." He shook her hand. He looked at Noah. "Hey, kid, you got taller." "I grew 2 inches, Noah said, with the pride of someone reporting a significant achievement. "You'll catch your dad in about 6 years." "That's what I'm planning." Pete almost smiled. He looked at Ethan again, and Ethan gave him a small nod that covered all the explanations he wasn't prepared to give in a driveway, and Pete accepted it the same way he'd accepted everything over the years, without demanding more than what was offered. The storage unit was around the back of the property, corrugated metal, the kind that gets hot in summer and cold in winter and smells perpetually of dust and time. Pete unlocked it and pulled the door up and left them to it, saying he'd be in the house if they needed anything. The boxes were stacked against the right wall, 10 of them, all labeled in Ethan's handwriting from 3 years ago. Short labels, practical ones. Kitchen, Noah room, books. And then at the back, 3 boxes with labels he'd written last, when he was running on no sleep and the particular exhaustion of grief that lives below the surface of everything. Claire, office. Claire, personal. Claire, MSC. He stood in front of those three boxes for a moment. Victoria stayed at the entrance. She didn't move forward. She gave him that. A few seconds just standing there before anything had to start. Noah came and stood beside his father and looked at the boxes with the Claire labels and didn't say anything, which was sometimes the most mature thing an 8-year-old could do. "Okay," Ethan said, mostly to himself. "Let's start." They worked through the first hour systematically. Ethan went through Claire, office, while Victoria worked beside him, carefully, without touching anything until he indicated it was okay. The office box was mostly what he expected. Notebooks, printed emails she'd kept for reasons he couldn't always determine, a folder of reference materials from her early career, 2 external hard drives that she'd used for work before getting sick and that he'd never had the right cable to check. He set those aside. The notebooks were her handwriting, small and left-leaning, dense on the page, and he paged through 2 of them carefully, looking for anything that felt like it didn't belong. References to the company, numbers that didn't match the ordinary accounting of a personal notebook. Nothing, or nothing obvious. Victoria took the reference materials and went through them with the focused attention of someone who knew what they were looking for. She went slowly. She held pages up to the light from the open storage door. She was looking for annotations, he realized, marks and margins, underlined passages, anything Claire might have added to something that looked innocuous. She was methodical, Victoria said, not looking up from a folder. This is organized. Even the way she labeled things. She had a system. Yeah. He turned a page. She always had a system. Walk me through it. What was her filing logic at home? He thought about it. Category first, then date. Always date. She'd have died before filing something without a date on it. He paused at the poor word choice, didn't take it back. She kept physical copies of things she thought were important, digital copies of things she used regularly. If she had something she needed to protect but couldn't destroy, she'd put it inside something else, something that looked like it belonged with everything around it. Victoria went still. Inside something else, she repeated. Yeah. She used to put important paperwork inside magazines, inside books, not hidden exactly, just layered, so if someone went through her things quickly, they'd flip through it and move on. Victoria set down the folder she was holding and looked at the boxes. We need to go through everything, not just the files, every book, every notebook, every envelope. It took another 2 hours. Noah had installed himself in a camping chair Pete had produced from somewhere, near the storage unit door in the patch of sunlight that came through the gap, and he alternated between reading and watching them with the patient attention of a child who understood this mattered without being told exactly why. At one point he said, "Dad, there's a box you haven't opened." Ethan looked up. Noah was pointing at the Claire, personal box in the back corner, the one Ethan had been circling around without approaching directly. "I know," he said. "Is that the one?" "I don't know yet." "Do you want me to go in the house?" Ethan looked at his son, the careful face, the steady eyes that were so much like Claire's. It still caught him sometimes, still pulled the breath out of him sideways. "No," he said. "Stay." He went to the box and pulled it toward him and opened it. It was what he'd expected and harder than he'd expected simultaneously. Her things, the personal ones, the ones that didn't have categories. A small wooden jewelry box that he hadn't been able to open in 3 years because he knew what was inside. A stack of cards, birthday and anniversary, and the ones that didn't have occasions, just her handwriting on the inside because she wrote cards the way some people write letters. A small frame with a photo of the 2 of them from before Noah, standing in front of a beach somewhere, young in a way that felt like another lifetime. A notebook with a cover that said personal on it in her writing. He went through the notebook first because it was the easiest thing to start with. It was personal in the domestic sense. To-do lists, grocery lists, a few pages of what looked like journaling. He turned each page slowly, not reading, just scanning for anything that didn't belong. Near the middle of the notebook, a folded piece of paper fell out. He unfolded it. It was a list of dates and numbers. No labels. Just dates going back about 6 years and 5-digit numbers next to each one, written in Claire's handwriting in pencil rather than pen. At the bottom, in slightly smaller writing, AG Consulting. Cross-reference March transcript. He looked at it for a moment, then he held it up for Victoria. She crossed the storage unit in 4 steps and took the paper from him. He watched her read it. He watched her expression shift. Not dramatically, not the way it might in a movie, but the small, careful shift of someone who's found confirmation of a thing they'd suspected. AG Consulting, she said. You know it? It's one of the shell companies. Her voice was controlled. This is a partial record. She was cross-referencing transaction dates. She was building the pattern before she went to my father. She looked up. This is important, but it's not the evidence. It's the map she used to find it. The actual documentation, the account records, the authorization signatures, those would be somewhere else. She wouldn't keep them together. She was protecting them, Ethan said. If someone searched the house, finding this wouldn't lead them to the rest. Smart, Victoria said quietly. It wasn't performed admiration. It sounded like something more private than that. Ethan turned back to the box. He went through the cards. He went through the jewelry box, feeling along the interior lining for anything that didn't sit right. He took out the small framed photograph and examined the back of the frame, removed the backing. Nothing. He sat back on his heels and looked at the empty box. He was missing something. He knew he was missing something because Claire had left him a map. That paper with the dates and numbers, cross-referenced and dated, and she would not have left a map without leaving the destination. She was too complete for that. She would have made sure. Even sick, even exhausted, even knowing what was coming at her, she would have made sure. He looked at Noah. Noah was looking back at him from the camping chair, book closed in his lap now. Dad, Noah said. What about the picture with us? Ethan frowned. What picture? The one of all 3 of us, the one Mom always kept on her desk at home. You packed it. I watched you put it in. Ethan went still. He knew the photograph Noah meant. 5x7 in a plain wooden frame, taken the summer before everything fell apart. Ethan and Claire and a 3-year-old Noah at a family barbecue at Claire's cousin's house. Claire had kept it on her home office desk. Always. It had been one of the last things he'd packed. He looked at the boxes he'd already gone through, then at the ones he hadn't. He went to the Claire, MISS box, and opened it, and found the frame immediately, near the top, wrapped in a dish towel, the way he'd packed it. He unwrapped it and looked at the photograph. The 3 of them, squinting slightly into summer sun, Claire laughing at something off camera, Noah in her arms with ice cream on his face. He turned the frame over. The backing was the same thin cardboard that came standard in cheap frames, held by 4 small metal tabs that you bent back to remove it. He bent them back, lifted the backing. Between the backing and the photograph itself, flat and folded twice, and small enough to be invisible unless you were looking, was a memory card in a sealed plastic sleeve. The sleeve had a strip of tape across the opening, and on the tape, in Claire's handwriting, in letters small enough that you'd miss them unless you knew to look, for when it's time. He held it in his palm and didn't move for a long moment. Victoria was watching him from across the storage unit. He looked up at her. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. She could see it in his face. She crossed to him and looked at what was in his hand, and he heard her exhale, just once, short and controlled, and she pressed her hand briefly against the back of her own neck, the gesture of someone who's been carrying a weight for a long time and has just been told they can put it down. Noah looked at both of them from his camping chair. Did you find it? He asked. Yeah, Ethan said. His voice came out rougher than he meant it to. We found it. But they drove back to the city with the memory card in Ethan's front pocket and almost no conversation between the adults, the kind of quiet that comes after something significant, when neither person is sure yet what shape the significance will take. Noah fell asleep in the back seat around the halfway point, his book sliding off his lap onto the seat beside him, and neither of them moved to pick it up. It was Victoria who finally spoke, somewhere on the highway with the city visible on the horizon. She wrote, "For when it's time," she said. Not a question, just repeating it, the way you repeat something you're still processing. Yeah. She knew you'd find it, eventually. She knew you'd go through those things. She knew I'd avoid it for a long time first, he said. She knew me. A pause. She left it where you'd find it, but only when you were ready to look. He didn't answer that. He wasn't sure there was an answer that didn't go somewhere complicated, and the highway wasn't the place for complicated. They went straight to Victoria's home office when they got back. Constance took one look at Noah, asleep against Ethan's shoulder, carried in from the car, and managed him gently up the stairs without being asked. Ethan was grateful for her in that moment in a way he hadn't quite expected. The memory card reader was in Victoria's desk drawer, one of those small multi-format ones. She connected it to her laptop and they both leaned in when the drive appeared on the screen. There were 4 files. 3 of them were documents, spreadsheets by the look of the file names. 1 was an audio file. Victoria opened the spreadsheets first. They were financial records, dense with transaction data, account numbers, authorization codes, dates going back 7 years. Even without understanding every column, Ethan could see the pattern once he knew what he was looking for. The same account numbers recurring across different subsidiary company names, authorizations traced to the same internal identifier, money moving through the network in a way that was designed to look like normal operational transfer, but was drawing from a central source and routing to a single endpoint. Hundreds of transactions, clear, clean, dated. "This is a full record," Victoria said. She was leaning so close to the screen that her breath was fogging it slightly. She didn't just find a thread. She pulled the whole thing, every transaction for 7 years. She clicked through pages. This took her weeks to compile, maybe longer. She would have had to pull records from multiple departments, cross-reference. She stopped, looked at Ethan. She put herself at enormous risk doing this. Every time she accessed a record that wasn't directly in her account's receivable scope, it would have flagged in the system. "She flagged it on purpose," Ethan said slowly, following the thought as he said it. "She knew someone would notice. That's why she moved fast. She compiled it all, and then she went to your father. Not because she trusted him completely, but because she needed to put it on record somewhere official before someone found out she was looking." "She was trying to force an official response," Victoria said, "so there would be a paper trail. So even if they discredited her, the record of what she'd reported would exist somewhere." She pressed her fingers against her mouth. "Except my father didn't create a paper trail. He killed it and gave Gerald the opportunity to move first." He opened the audio file. Claire's voice. He hadn't heard her voice in 3 years, not in any recording. He'd avoided it, the same way he'd avoided opening the Claire personal box. He'd been right to worry. Hearing it now, in Victoria's office, through laptop speakers, was like a fist around the base of his throat. She sounded tired but steady. She'd recorded this knowing it might be the only version of her account that survived. This recording is dated the 17th of March. "My name is Claire Mercer. I'm an accounts receivable analyst at Ashford Global Logistics. I'm making this recording because I reported financial irregularities to the company's founder, Thomas Ashford, 9 days ago. And instead of an investigation, I've been informed that I'm under internal review for the same irregularities I reported. I know what this means. I know what's coming." She paused. He could hear her breathing. The spreadsheets attached to this record document 7 years of fraudulent transactions authorized by Gerald Ashford through a network of shell companies. The primary account number is... She read it out. Every detail. Methodical. She named Gerald Ashford clearly, 3 separate times. She referenced the specific transactions, the dates, the amounts. She described how she'd found it, what she'd accessed, what pattern had first caught her attention. She gave the name of the shell company, a G Consulting, along with 4 others. She was thorough in the way she'd always been thorough, and her voice stayed steady for almost all of it, and only at the very end did something else come through, brief and controlled. "If you're hearing this, and I'm not there to explain it myself, please know that I did this because it was right. Not because I wasn't afraid. I was, but I had a son, and I had a husband, and I needed them to be able to live in a world where the record showed what actually happened. Whatever comes after this, I need the record to show what actually happened." The file ended. The office was completely silent. Ethan was looking at the laptop screen and not seeing it. He became aware after a moment that his jaw was clenched, and his right hand was pressed flat against the desk, and he was breathing in a way that required conscious attention to keep even. Victoria didn't say anything. She didn't offer a word or a gesture or any of the things people typically reach for in moments like this, and he was grateful for it in a way he wouldn't have expected. The last thing he needed was something to react to. He breathed. He let the silence be the silence. After a while, 2 minutes, maybe 3, he lifted his hand from the desk and straightened in the chair and said, with a voice that was rougher than usual, but functional, "She said Gerald authorized it. She named him directly, 3 times. "Yes," Victoria said quietly. "Is that enough?" "Combined with the spreadsheets?" She nodded slowly. "Yes, this is enough. This is more than enough. A forensic auditor would use these records to reconstruct every transaction. Gerald's digital signature is on the authorizations. The shell company structures are documented in detail. The audio is Claire's direct testimony, dated, with specific account references that can be cross-verified." She looked at him. This is enough to end him. He felt something settle in his chest. Not relief. It was too early for relief, and there was too much still ahead. More like the moment when a bone that's been set wrong is reset correctly. Painful, but the right kind of pain because the position is finally true. "He had her killed," Ethan said. He'd said it to himself in the dark for weeks, as a theory, as a possibility his mind had been circling without landing on directly. Saying it out loud, now, with evidence in his hands, was different, heavier, more real. She found out something that could have ended him, and he had her killed. "I believe so," Victoria said. She wasn't hedging to protect him. She was being careful with a thing that needed to be treated carefully. "I don't have direct evidence of that, yet. But the timeline," she paused. "She made the report in March. The internal review came in April. The formal accusation was made in May. She died in November of the following year." She didn't look away from him. The illness was real," he said. "It came out immediately, protective, before he'd thought it through." "I know," Victoria said. "I'm not saying it wasn't. I'm saying the circumstances, the timing of the pressure campaign, the way it accelerated, the stress of that period." She stopped. "I don't know exactly what Gerald did or didn't do, but I know that the conditions of her last 2 years were engineered by him, whatever form that took." He sat with that. He thought about the last 2 years of Claire's life, the exhaustion that had preceded the diagnosis, that they'd both attributed to work stress and the demands of caring for a young child. The way the accusation had come just as she was already starting to struggle, adding a weight to something that was already bending. He thought about whether any of it, any of the careful, steady deterioration, had been accelerated by what was being done to her. He didn't know. He'd never know completely. But the possibility sat in him now, like something he'd swallowed wrong, something that wouldn't go down clean. "What do we do with it?" he asked. Victoria turned back to the laptop. She was already thinking forward. He could see it, the way her eyes moved slightly when she was working through something. "We can't go to the SEC directly, not yet. If Gerald gets wind that the evidence has surfaced, he'll activate everything he has. He has lawyers, he has relationships, and he still has allies on my board who'd move against me the moment there's open conflict." She minimized the audio file. "But the shareholder meeting is in 5 weeks. Every major investor, every board member, the company's legal advisors, they'll all be in one room. If we present this there, in that context, in front of everyone simultaneously, Gerald has no time to suppress it. There's no quiet conversation that can manage it. It goes into the room, and it stays there." Ethan looked at her. "You want to blow it up in public." "I want to do it where he can't stop it," she said. "And I want to do it where the board members who've been quietly supporting him understand simultaneously and publicly what they've been supporting." Her voice was even, but there was something underneath it that was cold and precise and not entirely impersonal. He built his whole position on information control. Taking that away from him is the one thing he can't recover from. 5 weeks, Ethan said. 5 weeks to prepare, to build the presentation, to secure the evidence properly, get it copied, get it to a trusted outside attorney, get it in a chain of custody that can't be challenged. She looked at him. And to keep Gerald from finding out it exists until the moment it's too late. He leaned back in the chair and looked at the ceiling. 5 weeks. Living in this house, maintaining this arrangement, protecting this card, keeping his head clear enough to function normally while knowing what was on it. Noah was upstairs asleep with a photograph of his mother on his nightstand, and his mother's voice was on a file on this laptop, and the man responsible for the conditions of her last years was still operational, still dangerous, still unaware that a mechanic from Millfield had spent a Saturday in a storage unit and found what Claire had left behind for exactly this moment, for when it's time. He thought about her writing that. The act of sealing that card in that sleeve and taping it with that message, slim and quiet, between the backing and the photograph of the three of them. The three of them on a summer afternoon before any of it started, before any of it existed, squinting into the sun. She'd known someone would look. She'd trusted it. Not loudly, not with a letter or a video or anything that would have been found by someone searching. Just that small sealed card in a place that required the right person to think the right way to find it. Just those 6 words on a strip of tape. She'd known him well enough to know he'd eventually get there. He lowered his eyes from the ceiling. "Let's start," he said. Victoria pulled up a blank document on the laptop and looked at him. "Tell me everything you remember about the companies she worked with," she said. "Every name she ever mentioned, every person, every project. We're going to build this from both ends, and we're going to make it airtight." He pulled his chair closer to the desk. Outside, the city went on being the city, indifferent and enormous and unknowing. Somewhere in it, Gerald Ashford was probably at dinner, or at an event, or on a phone call, conducting the ordinary business of a man who'd never been called to account for anything. He'd spent years in that comfort. He'd had years of believing the evidence was gone, and the witness was gone, and there was nothing left to surface. He was wrong, and in 5 weeks he was going to find that out in the worst possible way. In a room full of people, with nowhere to go and nothing left to manage, facing a recording of a woman whose voice he'd thought was permanently silenced. Ethan flattened his hands on the desk and began to talk. The 5 weeks before the shareholder meeting were the kind of weeks that compress time and stretch it simultaneously. Days that moved fast when they were working and unbearably slow when they were waiting, which was most of the time. They built the presentation the way you build anything that has to hold under pressure. Slowly, carefully, with a great deal of arguing about details. Victoria wanted precision above everything. Every claim backed by a specific document, every document cross-referenced to a transaction record, every transaction traceable to an authorization with Gerald's digital signature. Ethan wanted clarity. He'd sit across the desk from her at 10 at night and say things like, "A room full of investors isn't going to read 7 years of spreadsheet data in real time. You need it in language a person can follow." And she'd tell him he was oversimplifying, and he'd tell her she was hiding behind complexity because it felt safer than being understood. And they'd sit there for a moment on opposite sides of that, and then one of them would concede something, and they'd keep working. He was right about the language. She eventually said so, which cost her something. He could see that it did. And he didn't make anything of it, which seemed to cost him something too, in a different way. They brought in an outside attorney named Sylvia Park, a woman in her late 50s who specialized in corporate fraud and who had the particular quality of treating catastrophic information with the same steady attention she'd give a routine filing. She took the memory card, made certified copies, established chain of custody documentation, and spent 2 days reviewing the spreadsheets with a forensic accountant she trusted. When she called Victoria back with her assessment, Ethan was in the office and heard it on speakerphone. The records were credible, the authorization signatures were traceable and verifiable, the shell company structures were consistent with the transactions and could be reconstructed from public registration records. The audio recording was dated, internally consistent, and referenced specific account details that matched the spreadsheet data. "This will hold," Sylvia said. "If it gets in front of the right people in the right context, this will hold." "The shareholder meeting," Victoria said. A pause. "That's a high-stakes venue for a first disclosure. Once you put it in that room, you can't control the reaction." "I know. There will be people in that room with competing interests. Some of them will try to suppress it even after it's presented." "I know that too." Victoria looked at Ethan across the desk. "But suppression requires time. A private disclosure gives Gerald time to move. A public one doesn't." Sylvia was quiet for a moment. "I'll have federal contacts on standby. The moment the meeting ends, the documentation goes to the SEC and to the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit simultaneously. I'll have that ready before you walk into the room. Good, Victoria said. Thank you, Sylvia. She hung up. The room was quiet for a moment. Federal contacts on standby, Ethan repeated. She's thorough. How long have you known her? 7 years. She handled a contract dispute for the company before I took over. I kept her number for situations I hoped I'd never be in. She looked at the laptop, at the presentation they'd been building for 3 weeks. We're close. Another week on the slide structure, then a full run-through. He nodded. Then, there's something else. She looked at him. I need to be the one who talks about Claire, he said. In the meeting, not just the documents. I need to stand up in that room and say her name and tell them what happened to her, what was done to her. He watched Victoria's face. Not because it helps the legal case, because it's the human record, because if we go in there and it's all numbers and authorizations and shell company structures, the people in that room will process it the way they process every financial scandal, as a corporate problem with a corporate solution. I need them to understand that there was a person, a 22-year-old woman who found something she was supposed to find and paid for it with everything she had. Victoria held his gaze for a long moment. That's going to be a hard thing to do in that room. I know. There will be cameras, reporters. The story will go public within hours. I know that too. Noah will eventually see it. He'd thought about that. He'd thought about it a lot, lying awake at 3 a.m. in the large, quiet bedroom while the city breathed outside. Yeah, he said. And when he does, I want him to see that someone stood up and said his mother's name and told the truth about her. I think that's worth more than the discomfort of the room. Victoria looked at him for another moment. Then she nodded once, definitively. Okay, she said. You speak. I'll build you a slot in the presentation. After the financial evidence, before the audio. Give the room the numbers first, then the face, then her voice. He looked at the table between them. Her voice is going to wreck the room. I know, she said quietly. That's why we play it last. Entente. Gerald Ashford made his move on a Tuesday, 12 days before the meeting. Came through a proxy. A financial journalist named Cole, who'd been covering Ashford Global for years, and who had, according to Marcus, received a very detailed anonymous briefing about Victoria's alleged unauthorized transactions. The article went up at 6 a.m. Ethan saw it before Victoria did, on his phone at the kitchen table before Noah was awake, and read it with the particular cold clarity of someone who knew exactly what it was. It was well written. It was specific. Specific in the way that only someone with access to the manufactured documentation could be specific. It named figures, dates, transaction descriptions. It quoted 2 unnamed board members who expressed concern about the company's direction under Victoria's leadership. It stopped short of explicit accusation, but the structure of it was a verdict dressed up as a question. Victoria came downstairs at 6:40 and found him at the table with his coffee and his phone and his expression, and she read his face before he said anything. She sat down, and he handed her the phone, and she read the article without visible reaction, which he'd learned by now was its own kind of reaction. She set the phone on the table. He knows we're preparing something, Ethan said. He doesn't know what. If he knew what, the approach would be different. This would be more aggressive, more final. He's trying to soften the room before the meeting, preemptively undermine my credibility. She was looking at the wall across from the table, thinking. He's scared. Scared people are dangerous. Yes. She pulled the phone back and looked at the article again. He's also just made a mistake. Ethan looked at her. How? This article references specific transaction details that only exist in the manufactured documentation, which means we can now prove, in addition to the fraud, that Gerald has been feeding false documents to the press to cover it up. That's obstruction. That's a separate charge. She looked up. He tried to get ahead of us and he handed us something. Ethan breathed out. So we add it to the presentation. We add it to Sylvia's package for the federal disclosure. The article itself becomes evidence of the cover-up operation. She stood up, already moving toward her office. Call Sylvia. Tell her to look at the Cole piece. Victoria. She stopped. Eat something first, he said. You've had nothing since yesterday afternoon. She looked at him with the expression she sometimes got when he said something practical in a moment that felt too large for practical things. A look caught between impatience and something that wasn't impatience. "I'll eat after I call." "I'll call Sylvia," he said. "You eat. 10 minutes. It'll still be a crisis in 10 minutes. A beat." She sat back down. He got up and made toast because it was fast and because the situation didn't call for anything elaborate, and he put it in front of her and called Sylvia from the kitchen counter while Victoria ate without appearing to notice she was eating, which was entirely normal for her. Sylvia had already seen the article. She had already begun drafting a supplemental memo. She said what Victoria had said about it being additional evidence, and then she said something else. "Tell Victoria to be careful this week. Someone who's nervous enough to do this is nervous enough to do more than this." Ethan relayed the second part when he hung up. Victoria looked at the toast in her hand. "I know," she said. "Marcus? He's been running security protocols for 2 weeks. He has people on the building." She took another bite. "There are things I've been managing that I haven't told you about because telling you would have been one more thing in an already very full situation." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "What things?" She met his eyes. Then, for the first time since this had all started, she laid it out without filtering it. All the security escalations, the 2 occasions in the past month when Marcus had identified vehicles outside the building that didn't belong, the email account of one of her junior analysts that had been accessed from an external IP, the attempt 3 weeks ago to get a copy of the shareholder meeting's guest list through a back channel. Gerald was watching, closely. He just didn't know what he was watching for. "If he had any idea what was on that memory card," Victoria said, "we wouldn't be having this conversation. He'd have moved to stop the meeting entirely. So the card is still safe. But we need to assume the level of surveillance increases between now and the meeting." "We don't change the plan," Ethan said. "No, we don't change the plan." Noah appeared at the kitchen doorway in his school clothes, backpack already on, hair incompletely combed. He looked at the 2 of them at the table. "Is something wrong?" "No," Ethan said. "Just planning." Noah looked at Victoria. "You look like when you're in your office for a long time." "I'm fine," she said. "Are you ready for school?" "I need a note for the field trip." "It's on the counter," Ethan said. "In the envelope." Noah located it with his eyes, grabbed it, and looked at Victoria again with the specific, evaluative gaze he'd been turning on her more frequently over the past weeks. Something in it measuring, something in it that Ethan recognized as his own son, trying to figure something out that he didn't quite have language for yet. "Okay," Noah said, and then he went and got the envelope and went to wait by the front door. Ethan and Victoria sat at the table for a moment in the wake of him. "He's worried about you," Ethan said. She looked slightly uncomfortable. "He shouldn't be." "I know, but he is." He looked toward the hallway where Noah had disappeared. "He does that. When someone matters to him, he watches them. Makes sure they're okay." He picked up his own coffee. "He gets it from his mother." Victoria was quiet for a moment. Then, "I'll be at the school pickup today." He looked at her. She was looking at the table. "I have a call at 3 that I can move," she said. "And he mentioned that Tuesday pickup is usually just Constance. I thought—" She stopped, lifted one shoulder slightly. "I'll be at pickup." He held his expression steady. "He'll like that," he said simply, and left it there. The night before the shareholder meeting, neither of them slept. Ethan knew because he heard her in the kitchen at 2 in the morning, the particular sound of the coffee machine, which was the sound that meant she'd given up on sleep. And he lay in his room for 20 minutes before getting up and going down. She was sitting at the kitchen island with both hands around a mug, hair loose, dressed the way she'd been dressed the first Saturday. Gray shirt, sweatpants, looking younger than she did in the armor. She looked up when he came in. "You should sleep," she said. "So should you." He went to the coffee machine. "How's the presentation?" "It's ready. It's been ready for 5 days." She turned the mug in her hands. "I keep going over it looking for the thing I missed." "You didn't miss anything." "I might have." "Victoria." He waited until she looked at him. "You didn't miss anything. I've gone through it with you 11 times. Sylvia's team has been through it." The evidence is what it is. Tomorrow is what it is. She looked at the counter. Gerald will have something prepared. He always does. He's had 30 years of managing situations. He knows how to read a room and respond in real time. Whatever we present, he'll have a counter. Not for the audio. She was quiet. He can counter documents, Ethan said. He can dispute spreadsheets, argue chain of custody, claim the records were manipulated. He'll have lawyers in that room ready to do exactly that. But he can't counter Claire's voice. He can't explain it away. He can't dispute the dates. He can't... There's no version of that recording that sounds like anything other than what it is. A person telling the truth because she knew she was running out of time to tell it. He drank his coffee. That's what tomorrow is. Everything else is set up. Victoria held his gaze for a moment. Then she exhaled, slow, controlled, the breath of someone releasing something they'd been holding too long. I owe her, she said. I know I keep saying that, but I need you to know I mean it differently now than I did when I said it on your doorstep. It started as obligation, inherited, something my family created that I needed to address. But now, she stopped. You knew her for about a year when she was 22, he said. I knew her the way you know people when you're 20 and not paying the right kind of attention. But I remember things about her. She used to eat lunch at her desk and she'd leave little notes on her monitor, so reminders, calculations, things she was tracking. You could see them from the hallway. She looked at the coffee. I walked past her office 100 times. I thought she was just organized. I didn't understand what I was seeing. She was always like that, Ethan said, even before any of this. The kitchen was quiet around them. Outside, somewhere in the city, something was moving. A siren, distant, going somewhere fast. Then it was gone. Thank you, Victoria said. Not the reflexive kind, the kind that comes after a pause. He looked at her. For what specifically? For coming, she said. For staying. She pressed her lips together briefly. For not treating this like a transaction after the first week. He thought about the storage unit, the memory card, the hours at the desk, the toast at 6:40 in the morning, the pickup line at Noah's school on a Tuesday. It stopped being a transaction pretty early, he said. I don't think either of us planned that. No, she said. We didn't. Bon moment. They sat there as the kitchen for another hour. Not talking about the meeting, not talking about Gerald, not planning or strategizing or reviewing, just sitting in the particular company of two people who'd been through something together and were about to go through something more, and who were, for one more hour, letting it be quiet. The meeting was held at Ashford Global's headquarters, 42nd floor, in a conference room that had been designed to communicate a specific kind of authority, floor-to-ceiling windows, a table that could seat 30, the company's name etched in steel on the wall behind the primary presentation screen. Reporters had been permitted into a separate overflow room with a live feed. 3 major financial networks had camera crews in the lobby. Gerald Ashford arrived 11 minutes before the meeting was scheduled to start, which Ethan registered from across the room. He was a large man in his mid-60s, silver-haired, with the kind of face that had probably once been handsome and now had the thick, settled quality of someone who'd spent decades being accommodated. He moved through the room with the comfort of a man on home territory, shaking hands, saying names, touching elbows. He looked at Victoria once from across the room and smiled at her. The smile of a man who believed he was watching something end. Ethan stood against the far wall near the door with Marcus, who was managing the room's security with characteristic quiet efficiency. Victoria was at the head of the table, setting up her laptop at the presentation station, talking to Sylvia, who was seated 2 chairs down with a legal pad and a composure like concrete. He looks relaxed, Ethan said quietly. Marcus said nothing, which was his assessment. The room filled, board members, investors, senior executives, legal representation on both sides of the table, and at least 4 people Ethan didn't recognize who had the particular look of people who'd been brought specifically for today. Gerald settled into his seat 3 positions from the head of the table. A position, Ethan noted, that was close enough to the presentation screen to make an intervention quickly. Richard Hale sat beside Gerald. He didn't look at Ethan at all, which told Ethan that Hale had been briefed, had been told something was coming from their side, something to watch for. The meeting opened with procedural matters. Victoria handled them with complete calm, which he knew cost something, and moved through the quarterly financials and operational updates with no visible indication that anything was different about today. She was giving Gerald nothing to read, letting the room settle into the assumption that this was a standard meeting with a non-standard tension running underneath it. Gerald spoke twice in the first 30 minutes, once to raise a procedural question about voting rights for the pending shareholder resolution, once to request that the company's outside auditors be given additional time to complete their review of certain capital expenditures. Both interventions were designed to look routine. Both were designed to plant seeds, the first questioning Victoria's authority, the second signaling there were financial questions that needed resolution before any major decisions. Victoria addressed both without breaking stride. Then she said, "I'd like to move to the main item of today's agenda, and I want to ask for your full attention because what you're about to see is not a quarterly matter." She clicked the first slide. It was the structure of the shell company network, clean, visual, designed the way Ethan had argued for it, not a spreadsheet, but a map, circles connected by lines, labeled with company names, with dollar amounts flowing between them like a diagram of a river system. Clear enough that you understood it in the first 10 seconds, specific enough that you couldn't dismiss it. The room's temperature changed. She walked through it methodically. The companies, the transaction history, the dates, the authorization signatures traced back to a single source. She named the source on the 7th slide, and she said Gerald Ashford's name in a voice that was entirely level, and she did not look at him when she said it. She kept her eyes on the room. Gerald's face did what faces do when something unexpected happens to a person who is very controlled. Almost nothing. A tightening. A slight elevation of the chin. And then, because he was who he was, he said, "Victoria, I think what you're describing is a significant misinterpretation of—" "I'll take questions at the end," she said, without raising her voice, without varying the pace. She clicked to the next slide. Hale put his hand on Gerald's arm, barely visible, a restraint or a signal to wait. She continued through the financial evidence for 18 minutes. When she finished the last slide, she looked around the room and said, "Before the documentation speaks for itself in its original form, I'd like to give the floor to someone who can speak to the human cost of what you've just seen. This is Ethan Mercer." He pushed off the wall where he'd been standing and walked to the front of the room and did not look at Gerald. He'd prepared something. He'd written it out and gone over it several times in the week before, and then 2 nights ago he'd put it away because he realized that reading prepared remarks in that room would be exactly wrong. That the only version of this that would land was the unpolished version, the version that sounded like a man standing in a room full of strangers telling them something true because it needed to be said. "My wife's name was Claire Mercer," he said. "She was 22 years old when she worked here. She was good at numbers and she was better at patterns, and she found something in your accounts receivable records that she was supposed to find because that's what accounts receivable analysts are for." He looked at the faces around the table, the board members, the investors, the lawyers, kept his voice even. "She took it to the founder of this company because she believed in the process. She believed that when you find something wrong, you report it, and the right people respond. Instead, she was investigated, accused, and fired. The accusation followed her for the rest of her life. When she died 4 years later, the accusation was still on her record." He paused. "My son is 8 years old. He's heard people at school say his mother was a thief. He's had to hear his father explain why that wasn't true, without being able to prove it." He breathed. "We can prove it now. And I needed to stand in this room and say her name to the people whose company she tried to protect, because she deserved to have someone stand up for her while she was alive and nobody did. The least I can do is do it now." The room was completely still. He stepped back and nodded to Victoria. She played the audio. Claire's voice came through the conference room's speaker system, which was high quality and clear, and the room had no ambient noise to compete with it because nobody was moving. "This recording is dated the 17th of March. My name is Claire Mercer." He watched Gerald Ashford's face while she spoke. The control was remarkable. 30, 40 seconds into the recording, Gerald was still composed. the face of a man managing a situation, calculating his response. But somewhere around the 2-minute mark, when Claire read the account numbers with complete specificity, when she named AG Consulting and the 4 other shells and traced the authorization chain back to its source with the methodical patience of someone who'd gone over this until she had it exactly right, somewhere in there, the calculation left Gerald's face. What replaced it was something older and smaller. Not guilt exactly, not remorse. More like the expression of a man who has been told for the first time in decades that he miscalculated something. He thought she was gone. He'd built the last 7 years on the assumption that she was gone. Her records, her testimony, her evidence, all of it buried with her under the weight of a manufactured accusation and the passage of time. He'd believed it. He'd been wrong. Whatever comes after this, I need the record to show what actually happened. The audio ended. For a moment, nothing happened. The room held the recording the way a held breath holds air, full, compressed, not yet released. Then Gerald moved. He was fast, faster than Ethan had expected for a man his age, and he was on his feet before half the room had processed that the recording was finished, and his voice came out differently than it had at the beginning of the meeting. Not managed now. Something underneath the management had pushed through. This recording cannot be verified. Chain of custody is non-existent. Any competent attorney will... The chain of custody documentation has already been filed, Sylvia Park said from her seat, not standing, using a voice designed for courtrooms, along with the complete financial records and a supplemental report on the coordinated media campaign using fabricated documentation. The filing was made 20 minutes before this meeting started, to both the SEC and the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. The silence was different this time. Gerald looked at Sylvia, then at Victoria, then, for the first time, directly at Ethan. Ethan held his gaze. He didn't offer anything in return. Not anger, not satisfaction, not a word. Just held it. Gerald looked away first. "I'd like to call for a brief recess," Hale began. "The motion on the floor," Victoria said, cutting across him cleanly, "is the ratification of the evidence disclosure and the referral for independent investigation. I'd like a show of hands." The hands went up around the table, one by one, some quickly, some after a beat of visible calculation, as investors and board members read the room and understood which direction they were standing in. The count was not close. It was not a deliberation. It was 12-3, with Hale and 2 others declining. "Motion carries," Victoria said. Gerald was still standing. He was looking at the table in front of him with the expression of a man processing the specific texture of how things end. There was a moment, just a moment, where something almost human crossed his face. What it was, Ethan couldn't name exactly. Not regret, more like shock. The shock of someone who has spent so long controlling outcomes that they'd stopped believing outcomes could escape them. The door to the conference room opened. 2 men in suits, federal agents, by the look of them, the particular federal quality of their shoes and their expressions, stepped in and spoke quietly to Marcus, who nodded and stepped aside. They walked to where Gerald was standing. One of them said his name. Gerald Ashford looked once more around the room, at the board, at the investors, at Victoria, at Ethan. And then he was walking with them toward the door, and the room erupted in the particular noise of a place where something irreversible has just happened. Voices, phones, chairs moving. Victoria didn't move from the head of the table. She stood with her hands flat on the surface and her eyes on the door through which Gerald had just walked, and her face was doing the thing it did when she was feeling something she hadn't yet decided how to handle. Ethan came to stand beside her. He didn't say anything immediately. The room was chaos around them. People on phones, reporters in the overflow room presumably losing their minds. Sylvia already coordinating with the legal team in the corner. "You okay?" he said finally. She took a breath, let it out. "That's my uncle," she said. Her voice was steady. "My father's brother. I spent Thanksgiving with him every year until I was 27. I know. I know it was right. I know. I just need a minute to know it and feel it at the same time." He stood there next to her while she took that minute, in the noise and motion of the room, and he didn't rush her toward the next thing. She straightened up. "Noah's at school." Constance has pickup today. Should we tell him tonight? About about Claire, the full version. Ethan had thought about this. He'd been thinking about it for weeks. Some of it, he said. The part that matters for him. That his mom wasn't a thief. That she tried to do something right. That we know the truth now. He looked at the door. The rest he can understand when he's older. Victoria nodded slowly. Then she turned to him, and he saw in her face the exhaustion of the last weeks finally arriving, now that there was space for it, and underneath that something else. The particular expression of someone who has just realized they're on the other side of something they weren't certain they'd make it through. "We need to call Sylvia," she said. "In a minute." "The press is going to—" "Victoria, in a minute." She stopped. He looked at her, and she looked at him, in the noise and aftermath of everything, and for a moment it was just that. Two people on the other side of something difficult still standing. "Thank you," he said, "for coming to my door." She blinked. It was the only thing that moved on her face. "You needed rain for that." "We got rain," he said. And she almost laughed. Not quite, but close enough that it counted. And then Sylvia was at Victoria's shoulder with a legal pad and a list of 17 things that needed immediate attention, and the room pulled them back in, and whatever the moment was, it was folded away into the noise and motion of what came next. The days immediately after the meeting were not the clean, exhaled relief that Ethan had sometimes imagined they might be. They were loud and complicated and full of other people's urgency pressing in from every direction. The story broke within the hour. By evening, it was the lead on 3 financial networks and climbing toward general news. By the following morning, Gerald Ashford's name was in every major publication alongside words like fraud and conspiracy and federal charges. And Claire's name was there too, not as an accusation this time, but as a detail in the larger story, described variously as a whistleblower, a former employee, a woman whose warnings had been suppressed. The framing varied by outlet. Some got it right. Some got it approximately right. One publication ran a photograph of her that Ethan hadn't known existed. A company photo from her time at Ashford Global, her hair shorter than he'd known it, looking slightly off-center from the camera as if someone had called her name just as the shutter clicked. He sat with his phone and looked at that photograph for a long time. Noah saw the coverage 2 days after the meeting, not because Ethan showed him. He wasn't ready to, hadn't figured out the right words yet, but because a kid at school had a parent who'd seen the news and mentioned it at the dinner table, and the kid mentioned it to Noah, and Noah came home that afternoon with the expression he got when he was processing something significant and hadn't yet decided how to hold it. He dropped his backpack at the door and found Ethan in the kitchen and said, without preamble, "Tyler's mom said Mom's name was on the news." Ethan set down what he was holding. "Yeah," he said. "Come sit down." Noah came and sat at the kitchen island, backpack abandoned in the hall, still in his jacket. He looked at his father with the careful, serious face of a child who has learned that some conversations require him to be older than he is. Ethan sat across from him and told him. Not everything. Not the full mechanics of the fraud, not the specific language of the recording, not the details of Gerald's arrest or the federal charges, but the shape of it, clearly and honestly. Mom worked at a company, and she found out someone was doing something wrong. She tried to report it, and instead of being thanked, she was accused of doing the wrong thing herself. She wasn't guilty. She was never guilty. She knew it. Dad knew it. And now it was proven, officially, publicly, on record. Noah listened without interrupting, which he did when things mattered. When Ethan finished, Noah was quiet for a moment. Then, "So, the people at school who said she stole money." "They were wrong," Ethan said. "They were repeating something that was a lie." "Do they know that now?" "Some of them will. It'll take time for people to... The news moves fast, but people's opinions move slower. Some people will update what they think. Some people won't." He held his son's gaze. "What matters is that the record is correct. Officially. Whatever anyone thinks, the record shows what actually happened." Noah looked at the counter, then back at his father. "Did you know? Before... did you always know she didn't do it?" "I believed her," Ethan said. "I knew in the way you know something when you know someone. but I couldn't prove it. Not until recently. Is that why we came here? Is that why Victoria? Is that what this was about? The question was fair, direct and fair, the way Noah's questions always were when he was actually trying to understand something rather than just asking. Ethan looked at his son and decided that the partial truth here was worse than the complicated truth. That was part of it, he said. Victoria had information about what happened to Mom, and she needed help, and we needed help, and it seemed like maybe we could help each other. He paused. It started that way. But it's different now? Noah said it simply, without pressure, just reading the thing he'd apparently been reading for weeks. Yeah, Ethan said. It's different now. Noah absorbed this. He sat there for another moment, and then he got up and picked up his backpack from the hall and went upstairs. And Ethan sat at the island alone for a while. Not sad exactly, not relieved exactly. Something in between that didn't have a clean name. When Victoria came home that evening, earlier than usual, which she'd been making a point of doing more frequently, she found him still in the kitchen, and she read the residue of the conversation on his face the way she'd learned to read him over the months. You talked to him, she said. Yeah. How did it go? He's 8, Ethan said. He processed it in about 6 minutes and went to do his homework. Probably better than I processed it. She put her bag on the counter and stood there for a moment. How are you? It was a question she'd started asking more directly over the past weeks. Not the reflexive kind people ask in passing. The actual question, asked while looking at him, waiting for an actual answer. I don't know yet, he said honestly. There are things I thought would feel finished when this was over, and they don't feel finished. I thought, when the record was corrected, I thought I'd feel like I'd done the thing I was supposed to do. And I do feel that. But she's still not here. And no amount of record correcting changes that. Victoria was quiet. She didn't try to fill it with something reassuring. No, she said. It doesn't. I'm okay. I want you to know I'm okay. I'm just being honest about what it actually feels like instead of telling you what sounds right. I know the difference, she said. With you, by now, I know the difference. The legal proceedings against Gerald Ashford moved with the particular bureaucratic momentum of federal cases, not fast, but with the accumulated weight of a case that the prosecutors had described, privately and then publicly, as one of the cleaner financial fraud cases they'd seen in a decade. The documentation was thorough. The authorization trail was clear. The audio recording was admitted as evidence with its chain of custody intact and its content verified against the financial records. Gerald's attorneys filed several motions attempting to suppress various elements of the evidence, and every motion was denied. He was charged on 11 counts: fraud, conspiracy, obstruction, and several specifics that Sylvia explained to Ethan in a phone call that lasted 40 minutes, and that he followed about 60% of. What he followed was enough. Gerald was not getting out of this. The architecture of what he'd built, the shell companies, the manufactured accusation against Claire, the coordinated cover-up that had run for 7 years. All of it was on record, and all of it was being prosecuted. Richard Hale resigned from the board before charges came his way, which Sylvia said was smart but probably wouldn't save him from a civil suit. 2 other board members followed. Victoria replaced them with people she'd chosen herself, which she described to Ethan in the manner of someone who is quietly doing something they should have had the authority to do a long time ago. The company survived. Not cleanly. The weeks after the meeting were turbulent in the specific way that comes when confidence is shaken and has to be rebuilt deliberately rather than assumed. Several smaller investors pulled out. 2 major contracts went through renegotiation. Victoria held calls with the company's largest shareholders and spoke to them in a way that Ethan could hear through the office door sometimes. Not the managed performance of a CEO controlling information, but a more direct register, something closer to honest. She told them what had happened and what she was doing about it, and what kind of company she intended to build. Most of them stayed. Some of them came back. She was different in the work after that, in ways that Ethan observed from the outside, and that she occasionally described from the inside during the late evenings in the kitchen that had become their particular version of unwinding. The ruthlessness she'd operated with before, the coldness that she'd worn like armor because it had been the operating language of the company she'd inherited. She was putting it down, not replacing it with softness, which would have been wrong for who she was, replacing it with something more demanding, genuine accountability, transparency where there hadn't been any, the willingness to be wrong out loud rather than covering errors before they could be seen. It's slower, she told him one night. Doing things this way is slower. But I sleep better, she said, which from Victoria was something close to a philosophical statement. The formal end of the arrangement came 6 months after the shareholder meeting, which meant it came 9 months after a stormy night in Millfield, when Ethan had opened a side door to find a woman standing in the rain with a broken umbrella and an expression like testimony. Sylvia had drawn up the paperwork to formally dissolve the marriage arrangement because it had been formalized quietly in the months between, and sent it over on a Thursday afternoon. Ethan found it in his email after picking Noah up from school. He read through it at the kitchen island while Noah was at the table doing homework, and the house was making its usual sounds around them. The paperwork was clean. Everything that had been promised was in order. The debt was gone, had been gone since the first week. Sylvia had filed the formal clearance, and the collections firm had been removed from the picture with a speed that illustrated what money could do when applied to the right problem. The arrangement had served its stated purpose and was now concluded. He was looking at the signature line when Victoria came in from work. She saw the open laptop. She saw his face. She put her bag down on the counter and stood there. "Sylvia sent it," he said. "I know. She sent me the same documents." He looked at the laptop and then at her. "Have you signed yours?" "No." A beat. "Why not?" She crossed her arms, which was what she did when she was thinking through something she wasn't sure how to say. Not defensive, just the posture of someone who needed the structure. "Because I wanted to talk to you first." Noah looked up from his homework with the peripheral awareness of a child tracking adult conversation without appearing to. He looked back down when neither of them said anything immediately. "Hey, bud," Ethan said. "Can you take your homework upstairs for a bit?" Noah looked between them, read the room the way he always did, gathered his things without complaint and went upstairs, and his footsteps on the stairs were the slow kind, the kind of someone giving the adults below him a moment to figure out what they were doing. Victoria unfolded her arms. She looked at the laptop, then at him. "I've been trying to figure out how to say this for about 3 weeks, she said, "and I keep reaching the same problem, which is that anything I say sounds like something I've said before, and I don't want to use words that have already been used incorrectly." He waited. "When I came to your door," she said, "I came because I needed something. I want to be honest about that because I've always been honest about it. I needed an image. I needed stability. I needed a man with no corporate ties who couldn't be weaponized against me. Those were real calculations, and I made them, and I stand by the fact that I was transparent about it from the start." She looked at him steadily. "But somewhere between that night and right now, I stopped calculating. I'm not sure exactly when. I think it was gradual enough that I couldn't locate the moment even if I tried." She paused. "Noah told me something last week." Ethan blinked. "What did he say?" "He said, and this is direct, from him, because your son has no filters when he's decided he's going to say a thing. He said that his mom used to tell him that you knew when something was real because you stopped trying to make it into something else. You just let it be what it was." She held his gaze. "He said he thinks this is real." The kitchen was very quiet. "He said that?" Ethan said. "Word for word. I wrote it down because it seemed important to get right." He looked at the laptop, the signature line, the formal, clean language of conclusion. Then he looked at the woman across the kitchen from him, the one who'd shown up in the rain with a broken umbrella and a proposition that should have been easy to refuse and hadn't been, and who had turned out to be someone entirely different from who she'd first appeared to be, which he supposed was also true of him, from her perspective. "I'm not the same person I was when I pulled that door open," he said. "Neither am I," she said. "I think that's the point. I have a son who's going to want to understand whatever this is. I know. I'd like to understand it with him. It won't be. It won't be organized. It won't follow a plan. Ethan, Something in her voice shifted. Not soft, exactly, but the place she went sometimes when she dropped the architecture of management and just said what was true. I've been organized my entire life. I've had plans since I was 20 years old, and most of them have blown up in ways I didn't anticipate. I think I'm done planning the parts of life that don't cooperate with plans. He breathed. You're not going to sign the paperwork? Not today, she said. Not without knowing what you want. He closed the laptop. It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't a movie moment with a score under it and the light at the right angle. It was a man closing a laptop in a kitchen while a city moved outside and a kid sat upstairs giving the adults their space. It was an imperfect gesture in the direction of something neither of them had a script for. I'm going to make dinner, he said. She looked at him. Come help, he said. You're terrible at it, and I'll complain about how you're chopping the onions, and that seems like an honest place to start. She almost smiled. Almost. I chop them correctly. You chop them inconsistently. That's not the same as Come help, he said. She came. Bagats. 3 months after that evening, Gerald Ashford was convicted on 9 of the 11 counts. The sentencing came 6 weeks later, 14 years, with additional civil liability that would take years to resolve through the courts. He was 66 years old and walked out of the courtroom with his lawyers in a way that looked to the cameras like a man who had prepared for this possibility for a long time and had made a kind of exhausted peace with it. Ethan watched the brief footage on his phone and felt very little except a settled quiet, the quiet of a thing finally finished, not the loud satisfaction he might have imagined, just the absence of a weight. Claire's record was formally expunged 4 months after the conviction, an administrative process that Sylvia navigated with her usual focused efficiency. The documentation of the original accusation was corrected in the company's files and in the public record. Her employment record was updated. The word that had followed her name for years, the implicit one, the one that lived in how people said it, was removed. Ethan received notification of the expungement on a Tuesday morning via email from Sylvia's office. He read it twice. He was in the garage of the shop he'd reopened 2 months earlier, not the Millfield one, a different space, in the city, a rental in a district where the rents were uncomfortable but manageable, with 2 bays and a corner that got good light and a sign above the door in the same style as the old one, because some things you carry forward. He read the email and put his phone in his pocket and went back to work on a transmission that needed his hands and his attention, and he worked on it for another hour in the particular focused quiet of someone who knows what they're doing, and when he finished, he sat on an overturned crate in the corner and thought about Claire for a long time. Not with grief, exactly. Or not only with grief. He thought about her the way you eventually learn to think about people you've lost. Not just the ending, but the whole shape of them. The way she'd laugh at things she found unexpectedly funny. The hard laugh that caught her off guard. The way she'd held Noah when he was small, with the specific confidence of someone who'd never doubted they were supposed to be a parent. The way she'd eaten lunch at her desk in a company hallway while a 20-year-old walked past and didn't understand what she was seeing. The way she'd made sure, even at the end, to leave a map for someone to follow. To leave the record right. She'd been right about most of the things she'd been right about. He missed her in the particular way that doesn't diminish, but does change. Settles into the architecture of who you are until it's not a wound anymore, but a room. A room you can stand in and look around and recognize all the shapes of it, and still live in the rest of the house. He picked up his phone and called Victoria. She answered on the second ring. I saw Sylvia's email, she said, without preamble, because she'd been watching for it too. Yeah. A pause. Are you okay? Yeah, he said. I am. And meant it. Noah's pickup is at 3, she said. I'll be there. I know. He looked at the light in the corner of the garage. I'll be done by then. He hung up and sat there for another minute, and then he got up because there was more work to do, and the afternoon was moving, and his son would be coming out of a school building at 3 o'clock looking for familiar faces and finding 2 of them, which was more than it had been for a while. And that meant something even if it was hard to name exactly what. 6 months later, a full year past the shareholder meeting, a year and a half past a stormy night in Millfield, the 3 of them were at Pete Callahan's property on a Saturday in September, because Pete had finally organized the thing he'd been threatening to organize for 2 summers, which was a cookout involving more people than his backyard could reasonably hold. It was the kind of afternoon that September produces when it's still trying to be summer. Warm enough for short sleeves, but with an edge in the shade, the light at that particular angle that makes everything look like it's being photographed. Pete had strung lights between the trees even though it was midday because he'd bought them and wasn't going to wait until evening. There were people everywhere, the comfortable chaos of a gathering where most people know each other and are okay with the ones they don't. Noah was somewhere in the back of the property with 3 kids he'd located within 11 minutes of arrival. His laugh carried over the general noise periodically, high and unguarded, the laugh of a kid who is exactly where he should be with nothing he needs to manage. Victoria was sitting on a wooden bench near the edge of the gathering, not quite in the middle of it, because she'd never entirely lost the instinct to orient herself toward the perimeter of a social situation. She'd told Ethan once that she'd always operated better from the outside watching in, and he'd said that made sense for someone who'd spent their whole life in rooms where she had to know all the exits. And she'd been quiet for a moment and then said yes, that was probably accurate. She was talking to Pete's wife, Donna, who was the kind of person who could draw anyone into conversation without making them feel interrogated. Victoria was managing the conversation with the particular visible effort of someone who was trying and knew they were trying and had decided trying was worth the discomfort. Ethan watched her from across the yard, plate of food in hand. He thought about the word that Donna would probably use later to describe Victoria to someone else. Composed, probably, or private. Not cold. Not anymore. People who spent time around her these days usually landed on careful. She was a careful person. She paid attention to things. She noticed what other people missed because she'd spent years needing to. She was not easy, and she was not uncomplicated, and she would probably never be the kind of person who moved through a backyard cookout with the loose comfort of someone who'd never had to think about rooms and exits. But she was here. She'd come. She'd sat down on a wooden bench in Pete Callahan's backyard, and she was talking to Donna, and she was trying, and Ethan had learned over the past year that for Victoria, that was the equivalent of someone else making it look effortless. He crossed the yard and sat beside her. Donna smiled and excused herself with the intuition of a person who reads situations accurately and acts on that reading, and then it was just the 2 of them on the bench in the September afternoon with the party happening around them. "How are you doing?" he said. "I've been asked that question by 4 people in the last hour," she said. "And?" "And I've said I'm good each time." She looked at him. "Which is true. I'm just not used to being somewhere where people ask that and wait for the actual answer. Pete's people do that. It's a whole thing with them." "I've noticed." She looked out at the yard. Noah found someone who knows how engines work. Pete's nephew, he restores motorcycles. Noah's been following him for 20 minutes. That's high praise from Noah. She was quiet for a moment in the way she was quiet when she was close to saying something she'd been thinking about for a while. He recognized it by now. The specific quality of that silence. "I've been thinking about what Sylvia said," she said finally. "When the expungement came through, she said the record is clean now, officially clean, and I've been thinking about what that means, what it means for the work we do going forward, at the company." She looked at her hands. "I want to create a position, a permanent internal ethics role, separate from legal, separate from audit, with direct access to the board. Someone whose entire job is to be the person Claire should have been able to go to. Someone who can receive a report from an entry-level analyst and treat it with the same seriousness as a report from a senior director." She glanced at him. "I know it's not. It doesn't undo anything. It doesn't change what happened to her, but it changes what happens next time." He looked at the yard, at Noah, in the distance, gesturing at something mechanical with the focused energy of a kid explaining a thing he loves. "She'd like that," he said. "She'd probably also have 12 structural suggestions for how to implement it." Victoria almost laughed. It kept being almost with her, and each time it was a little less almost than before. "I want to name it after her," Victoria said. If that's all right with you." He looked at her. She was looking back at him with the careful, open expression that she'd gradually allowed herself to wear more often, the one that didn't have the calculation in it. "Yeah," he said. "It's all right with me." The afternoon moved around them. The lights Pete had strung between the trees caught the angle of the dropping sun and lit up in the early evening in a way that was purely accidental and happened to be exactly right, the way things sometimes are when nobody planned them. Noah came running across the yard at some point and arrived between them on the bench at speed, slightly out of breath, smelling like outdoor afternoon, and launched directly into a detailed explanation of a 1974 engine restoration that Ethan followed completely and Victoria followed approximately 30% of and listened to with full attention anyway. The three of them sat on the bench in the September evening while the party went on around them, and Noah talked, and Ethan watched the light change, and Victoria sat with her shoulder close enough to his that he could feel the warmth of it. It wasn't a perfect picture. It wasn't the ending anyone would have planned from the beginning. There was still grief in it, because grief doesn't vacate. It just learns to share space with the living. There were still things between Ethan and Victoria that hadn't been figured out and would take more time and more imperfect conversations at late-night kitchen tables. There was still a little boy who had a photograph of his mother on his nightstand and always would. But there was also this, a Saturday evening in September with lights in the trees and a kid talking about engines and two people sitting close enough that warmth passed between them without needing to be acknowledged. There was the record, finally clean, showing what had actually happened. There was a year of evidence that trust, built slowly and imperfectly by people who had reason not to trust, holds differently than the kind that comes easily. Holds better. Claire had needed the record to show what had happened. It did now. And the people she'd left behind were still here, still standing, not unbent, but standing, which is the only version of standing that means anything. That was enough. Not as a consolation, as a thing that was genuinely, honestly enough. Noah finished his explanation and looked at the two of them with the expression of someone who has said his piece and is now evaluating the audience. "You weren't really listening," he said to Victoria. "I was," she said. "The 1974 engine has a problem with the carburetor." Noah blinked. "That's actually right." "I pay attention," she said. He considered her. "Yeah," he said, like he was confirming something he'd already decided. "You do." He climbed off the bench and went back to find Pete's nephew, and the evening kept going in its easy, imperfect way, and the lights in the trees got brighter as the sky got darker, and Ethan thought about nothing in particular for a while, which was its own kind of good.